Hello and welcome back to this damn full idealistic crusade. In this video I'll be discussing and reviewing the Arrow Video 4K UHD limited edition release of the 1963 classic The Great Escape, based on the real-life events as depicted in Paul Brickhill's source book, and of course famously a passion project and directed by John Sturges. The film is of course iconic for its ensemble cast, famous moments, one-liners, and being a beloved film as it is watched most often in the UK every Christmas as a sort of annual holiday tradition. It is based on real events, although very much dramatized for the sake of the film and including more American involvement than what actually occurred during World War II. But also a lot of that is due, I think, to the film following very clearly a lot of the successful ideas and formula in a way of The Magnificent Seven, which director Sturges had made several years before with Steve McQueen, James Coburn, and Charles Bronson. While that film was obviously remaking Kurosawa's Seven Samurai as a Western, it did establish an ensemble cast and a particular pace over a film that felt a bit longer, and so I think a lot of that transposes over to The Great Escape. So if you're watching through Sturges' filmography, I think this point in the early 60s is when his style starts to shift, and then he would continue in this vein, especially with films like Ice Station Zero, which is even more extended and also having a military theme like The Great Escape, but of course based on a fictional novel by Alistair MacLean instead of an actual historical event. What's remarkable about The Great Escape as a film is not only is it entertaining, but it's actually depicting the real events as best as the production could possibly manage. They actually had the primary individual responsible for developing and actually making the escape tunnels during the escape from Stalag Luft 3, Wally Floody, who actually managed to recreate what he had overseen in the first place to such a degree that he started getting flashbacks to his time in the prisoner of war camp during the film's production. Another element to really consider is that this film was being produced in Europe, so it had a certain air of authenticity, and they actually built a replica of the original prisoner camp. And so there's an incredible sense of you are there as an audience member because you're seeing all of the actors in a real physical environment. It's not faked as it was going to be originally due to the production thinking at first they could shoot it in the US and sort of cheat it to look like Europe and use a lot more studio sound stages. Thankfully, those plans were scrapped for various reasons and the production moved to Europe. But it was also only a certain period of time after the war had ended. If you think about it, the war ends in 1945 and the film comes out in 1963, so it's less than 20 years of difference. So when you actually see a lot of the German actors in the film, a great deal of them were actually in the war in some capacity, and even Donald Pleasance had actually been a prisoner of war in one of the German camps and had that to draw from. So you had not only the sense of the war and everyone's experiences still being something of recent memory, but also you had the ability to much more easily recreate the items of the period in terms of the production design, because a lot of that stuff was still around. You had to, obviously take the time to recreate things in terms of all of the paraphernalia and the uniforms and such, but, some of the uniforms and other things were still kind of floating around and could be feasibly gathered together, and there were enough materials still around, as it hadn't been a full 20 years since the end of the war, that it was a lot easier to recreate the entirety of Stalag Luft 3 and actually stage The Great Escape as best as humanly possible, of course, with the hyper-dramatized version as we see in the film. So had this been made later, essentially, it's a lot harder to pull all of that off. And so a lot of these factors do make the film a rather unique sort of time capsule in two different ways. It's a time capsule of the film industry and everyone's careers at that time in 1962-63, but it's also a time capsule of being able to very faithfully reproduce a lot of the World War II elements because it wasn't too far removed from the actual war years, and a lot of the people in the cast and crew had been obviously involved in the war, and so it made them even more concerned about doing the story of the real men's sacrifice justice. And all of this does come through in the final film. It is very much, I think, the point at which John Sturges' career sort of hinges, because after this point he never had as big of a major success, and it's obviously patterned in some ways, and I think some kind of unconsciously, after what he had done on The Magnificent Seven. It's also a bigger and longer film, but it does have reason for being that way, because it is depicting, obviously, prisoners of war in a camp making repeated attempts to escape over an extended period of time, and having to put the audience in there with the prisoners and seeing how the prison life develops and how the camp manages to find ways of coping with things. Not everyone is able to do this, but it also means we get to spend time with all of the ensemble cast. It doesn't allow for all of the characters to be as fully developed as they would be if they were lead characters, but we do need that time to get the sense of camp life, to understand the need for escape and why it's so difficult, but also to admire the ingenuity of these characters that we've had time to live with and come to appreciate and admire. And in doing this, the film is able to incorporate all the little bits of business that happened in reality as depicted in Paul Brickhill's book, and then you're able to accurately retell the story, even though the film takes a great deal of liberties. And when you actually look into the history of the real escape from Stalag Luft 3, it's amazing just how much of the real life events are replicated in the film, even though various characters are sort of amalgamations of multiple real life individuals, or certain bits of business are given to other fictional characters when they were done by other people. And the big difference is, of course, there was only limited American involvement during the real escape attempt. But in the film, there is heavy American involvement because it's an American film being American financed with American stars. So obviously that's a concession to the film industry. But in a very striking way, all of that's not really a detriment to the film and how it depicts historical events. There were many past war films that obviously shifted things towards an American focus when there was little to no actual American involvement in that moment in history or that particular conflict. And that was something that was very harshly criticized at the time, understandably so. But here in The Great Escape, it's never done at the cost of disrespecting the sacrifice of all of the escapees and all the prisoners in the camp. It's never done to rewrite history. It's done to make a consistently engaging film, because most audiences aren't going to have the full background of knowledge in terms of the real historical events. And it was primarily designed for American audiences, so obviously there had to be some concessions made. But again, it's never done to take anything away from the actual historical events. So it's one of the few times, I think, where this concession actually manages to work. And it also helps to focus the film in certain areas by giving us certain iconic characters and moments that are sort of built up out of what happened in reality, but sort of over-dramatized in areas and made more entertaining. And that, most of all, is focused around the film star, Steve McQueen. And that's really something important to discuss in regards to this film, because this is really the film and the performance, the very role that cemented McQueen as a top film star for all time. If you mention The Great Escape, most people immediately think of some moment with McQueen, who is the focus of the primary marketing campaign, most of the posters, and of course the most iconic moments of the film, which are the motorcycle chase and famous jump, which were invented entirely for the film, but every time you see it, no matter how much you know about the actual historical events, it is unquestionably the moment where no one can tear their eyes away from the screen. It speaks volumes for all of the various historical events that happened by being larger than life and representing all of those themes, even though none of that actually happened in reality. I think McQueen's iconic star persona in the film as Hiltz also helps to give the audience a sort of a focal point to latch onto, because he's only used as a character sporadically throughout the film. And I think this also is a good way to look at the film's editing, which is extraordinarily well executed. This is one of those films where, yes, it's longer, but it's a film whose rhythms you fall into because you essentially enter the camp along with everyone else, and you then become sort of complicit in the schemes to start an escape plan. Like any great heist film, it makes you feel included and thus sets the ticking clock of suspense throughout the whole film. Had the editing not been as precise as it is and recognized the energy that McQueen brings to the film, it very easily could have felt like a dragging narrative and been even longer. Sturges had discussed in some of the interviews included in the supplements that he did take footage out of the film significantly, but they finally arrived at the near 3-hour running time as necessary, but it never manages to suffer some of the issues of his other films, such as Ice Station Zebra, which doesn't have quite that same level of editing focus. This was also a film that was very much suffering from script problems. It is credited to the great W.R. Burnett and James Clavell, among others, but there were constant on-set rewrites and a great deal of improvisation. This was also something that McQueen had a lot of input into because he was never quite satisfied with what his characterization was, and so he and Sturges had to find a handle on that during the shoot. But this also meant that the rest of the ensemble cast, from Coburn to James Garner to Donald Pleasance, and all the incredible faces that we cherish in the film, managed to be able to accentuate their characters even more and make them feel even more personable and lifelike. And these little bits of improvisation thus are an extra amount of spice and flavor that make all of the individual moments add up to a collective whole, and again make it feel like you're literally living in the camp alongside everyone and are complicit in the attempt to escape. Essentially, there are so many elements surrounding The Great Escape that when you look at them, seem to indicate a film that was not going to work or shouldn't have worked, but it works. It has always worked, and I think it immediately will capture any audience of any age, of any era, because it is depicting events that actually did happen. Yes, they are dramatized, and some elements are fictionalized, and certain elements are changed around to make a more exciting film. But that is an important part of making a film, even when you're discussing and reenacting events that actually happened in history. You do need some degree of drama, because if you just retold things exactly as they happened, it's going to be pretty dry, and it may not be something that audiences can connect with, especially if they don't have background in that historical time period or any knowledge of the events. The danger is always in how do you dramatize certain events to make things entertaining, to hold an audience's interest, and do so without ever discrediting anyone or dishonoring the actual people involved in the original events and the sacrifices they made. And this is one of those times where everything manages to come together. There is a degree of it being sort of a lightning in a bottle type of production, because it's a film that overcomes all of its production shortcomings and all the hurdles they had to get over. It's a film that by the time you finish it, you feel like you've gone on this journey along with the characters, and you understand the degree of sacrifice that so many made in what was seen by some as a superfluous gesture. Plus, you get the added inducement of seeing so many great stars, a lot of them much more early in their careers before they became giant names. Again, the same sort of extra level of entertainment factor that you get from The Magnificent Seven, and another, I think, clear echo between that earlier film and its effect and presence that's being felt in The Great Escape. This is a film that's bigger and larger in scale simply because it had to be. Yes, it's a bit more fanciful in areas than the actual historical events, but again, that's never at the cost of discrediting or not fully respecting the incredible sacrifices and incredible efforts and achievements that the prisoners of Stalag Luft III made during The Great Escape. And everything you see in terms of the tunneling and the trolley carts and the ingenious methods of disguising scraps of clothing to then try to look like and pass for something that could be worn in the outside if they managed to escape, or recreating German uniforms out of scraps of clothing, or finding ways of hiding the dirt. All of that comes from the real historical events and is an extraordinarily faithful adaptation of what the prisoners actually managed to do. So the film is also a testament to the incredible efforts and sacrifices everyone made. But the film is also, in that sense, a monument to human perseverance and human ingenuity when faced with overwhelming odds. And I just find it remarkable every time I return to the film how much it manages to do so well in a film that on paper should not have worked and had so many production headaches and scripting problems especially that meant it should have been a bit of a mess. And it's a longer film with an ensemble cast that tells a story set over an extended period of time, so it should have felt long and a bit dreary and been very easy to get muddled. And it never is. So while I think you can see some elements here that would later grow and make some of Serge's later films a bit bloated in areas and not quite as effective, I think this film remains a perfect balance of being incredibly respectful to the past, of trying to get it as accurate as possible in terms of the setting, the location, the sets, of recreating as much as they possibly could, and also being incredibly entertaining, so much so that it's a film you can return to and re-engage with and find something new. And after a few viewings, it becomes one of those films that's almost like a cherished friend in a way. It's like a film you step back into. So it's perfectly understandable that it's become a holiday tradition in the UK and other countries of watching every single year, even though you know what the outcome is. And in that sense, it's also a way to pay tribute to the actual men who sacrificed everything during the real escape. Every time you rewatch the film and hear Elmer Bernstein's iconic theme once again, it brings a smile to the face. So by the time Steve McQueen hops on the stolen German motorcycle and goes hell for leather for the border, your heart is in your throat, as it always has been when watching that sequence. This is certainly the kind of film that can no longer be made today, because people are not going to go to these level of efforts of making a World War II film about real events, made entirely reel for real in terms of being on the locations and recreating as much as they possibly could while being not too far removed from the actual war years. This is a film where, when they needed to crash a plane as part of the final act escape sequence, one of the production actually flew the plane and crashed it himself. I mean, that's something that you cannot fake, and that is felt in every frame of this film. There's a physicality, there's a tenacity of actually seeing Steve McQueen on that motorcycle doing all the stunt writing himself, and of course, if you know some of the anecdotes, knowing that he's also doubling the Germans, so he's actually chasing himself and making every insurance company in the world lose their minds because the star of the movie is doing all that stuff on the bike. So now I would like to do a brief mention of the film's overall video history, which does lead into and explain why the Arrow video release is using the particular source it is and why it's so important compared to past releases. The film was United Artists originally, but that of course meant that it fell into the MGM library during the video era. It didn't really get a proper release until the first letterbox presentation on the deluxe Criterion Laserdisc set. This is a film that needs to be seen in its original aspect ratio, as when it's pan and scanned, you lose the impact of pretty much all the visuals. Of course, the Criterion Laserdisc visually is a significantly older master, and it was the first major time the film had been presented in letterbox, so it's amazing to look at for the time period of when it was made. It's really just a stepping stone in the film's video history. The major important factor were the release's supplements, in particular the commentary track that was recorded for this Laserdisc, which featured extensive commentary from the cast and crew, but most of all, significant interview portions with John Sturges himself, who of course would no longer be around when the film would get various revisits on home video. A couple years later, MGM would do their own letterbox Laserdisc, which I have here. As was common, MGM would typically license to Criterion and then either reuse that video master or make their own when they came around to doing a letterbox Laserdisc, and then that would get bounced down to the next couple of VHS reissues, but in pan and scan. But when this transfer was made, it's obviously higher quality than what the Criterion version had, and had a seemingly untouched transfer of the original mono mix. So for a great number of years, this Laserdisc has been the best sounding version of the film. But when MGM made this transfer, they apparently scanned a master source of some kind and exposed more picture information than they were technically supposed to. So on this release and the 1998 DVD, which used this master as its source, you have an extraordinarily wide image, something more along the lines of 2.75 to 1 when you look at it. So it has extreme amounts of additional picture information, but it's not what anyone intended for an audience to see, as it's not the proper scope compositions as the film was shot in and released as. It's just for this particular version that appeared on Laserdisc and the first DVD, you have the ability to see more of the full camera aperture in terms of the fuller image that's being captured, but it is not really the way you should watch the film, but they're the only releases of this version. So if you're a fan of this film and you love studying composition and aspect ratios, it's important to hang on to one of these. Plus, the Laserdisc has the all-important PCM mono track. You can pick up the 1998 DVD for extraordinarily cheap. It's got the standard generic art and was repackaged many times. I have it in this later 2-pack with the Peckinpah Classic Junior Bonner, but you can always tell it's the 1998 disc by actually looking at the disc itself. MGM would finally revisit the film in 2004 for a 2-disc special edition DVD set with an updated transfer in the correct aspect ratio, but this did have a processed version of the original audio plus an audio remix, but it did give us a great deal of wonderful supplements, most of which are the bulk of the supplements on all releases since. When MGM eventually revisited the film for its Blu-ray release, they did perform a new supposedly 4K scan, but the Blu-ray that was put out showed much more of a revisionist color timing, did not include the original mono mix, only the 5.1 remix, and did show signs of grain management here and there. It was not really the presentation any of us had expected or wanted to see, but we've had to essentially live with versions of that ever since. The color timing was the major issue, along with the lack of the original audio track. A number of fans attempted color regrades over the years and adding back some form of the mono track from previous video releases. In 2020, the Criterion Collection released a Blu-ray of the film, seemingly from an updated MGM 4K master. This had brand new work performed on it in terms of the color grading and the sourcing of the original mono mix. They did reference a variety of elements, and this is a far better presentation than the initial MGM Blu-ray, but it also had a lot of room for improvement. I don't think the color was 100% spot on, and unfortunately the new mono mix transfer had various degrees of overprocessing and some other issues, which made it still not as good as the MGM Laserdisc PCM. Otherwise, this added a couple new nice extras, included most of the MGM Legacy supplements, and ported over the all-important Criterion Laserdisc commentary. Then in 2022, Kino Lorber brought out their 4K UHD edition of the film, which was in SDR. This was an improvement over the Criterion Blu-ray in a number of areas, especially in image quality and color timing, but it was still coming from the same MGM 4K master, complete with some of the same damage marks and things, and it still had a compromised version of the mono mix, so it also didn't sound as good as the old MGM Laserdisc. It ported over most of the MGM supplements, but none of the Criterion ones, and had nothing new otherwise. The big issue with this release most people had was that it did not have any form of HDR, and itself was coming from an already dated pre-existing MGM 4K master. Now that brings us to the Arrow Video release, and in terms of their workflow and transfer process, I'd like to quote from the booklet. The 4K restoration was completed by MGM. It was sourced from 4K scans of the original camera negative and an inner positive. References for accurate color grading included an original dye transfer print from the Academy Film Archive and separate prints owned by Martin Scorsese and Quentin Tarantino. The original monaural soundtrack was sourced from the original sound negatives and magnetic reels held by MGM, restored by Bad Princess Productions. The alternate 5.1 remix was created in 2002 by Chase Audio. The 4K HDR10 and Dolby Vision grading was completed by Fidelity and Motion, and the 4K master was supplied by MGM through Park Circus, with additional grading and restoration by Arrow Films. So in terms of picture quality and what you're getting with the presentation on the Arrow UHD, what all of this means is that Arrow essentially took the pre-existing MGM 4K master they were supplied with, as was used by Criterion and Kino before them on their releases, and did additional work to make it as good as it possibly could be. They did the additional HDR grading work themselves and made sure to do the grading in SDR, HDR10, and Dolby Vision so you get an accurate presentation regardless of which format you can display at home. Now, this is the same master as used before, and unfortunately it is not free of damage and blemishes that pop up sporadically throughout. So if you've seen this before and you've noted those moments, you will see those again here, and probably a bit more visible due to the increased visual quality and HDR presentation, not to mention the significantly superior encoding on the feature disc by Fidelity and Motion when compared to the previous Kino Lorber Blu-ray. This means when you're watching the transfer, you do need to expect some occasional bits of things that are seemingly inherent to the sources that were being used. There are a handful of visible hairs in the gate or in the top and bottom edges of the frame. They are never major, but they are there and seemingly part of the elements, or dating back perhaps to the original photography. There are also a handful of marks and slight scratches and lines creeping in that are simply part of this master and were either part of the original materials that were being transferred or not addressed during the original scan and restoration process, which was seemingly done in at least 2020 or before. So again, these are things that have been seen on the past two releases, but they may be a little bit more noticeable here on this Arrow presentation because the master itself has been polished and improved as good as it can be, and thus some of the source limitations and things that are baked in are going to jump out at the viewer a bit more. All of this is understandable and nothing that really bothers me. I was just surprised in revisiting this transfer to see just how many little blemishes and things were already there in the MGM restoration master. I don't know if these particular slight source issues could be addressed with a complete completely brand new scan and restoration workflow if they started from scratch, or maybe dialed down some, but a good number of them do seem to be inherent in terms of the visible hairs that creep in. But there's a couple spots of small bits of damage here and there that are fleeting that you will notice over the course of the entire film, but none of them are detrimental or anything that you wouldn't expect in a film of this age, but there are enough of them that you'll probably start to notice them. And since the visuals have been improved to such a great degree on this Aero presentation, you may notice them more here than you did on either the Criterion or Kino releases. The major enhancement here is, of course, the HDR presentation, which is in both HDR10 and Dolby Vision. I viewed the film in Dolby Vision and sampled the HDR10. Both are excellent and very, very tasteful. I'm not really a big fan of HDR on catalog titles, and admittedly, I'm very, very, very picky about any spots being perhaps too bright or too dark, and especially any moments that might have some brightness levels cause certain elements of the frame to maybe jump out a little bit. Here, there is a slight degree of that here and there, and just a few fleeting moments, a couple spots where some signs on walls that are themselves sort of a flat white almost sort of pop out just a tad, and also some of the searchlights or light reflections on metal. These are things that are common to HDR in terms of catalog films having some moments that may seem a bit bright for a film of that era. It's very much a tightrope to walk on in terms of doing film restoration in the HDR age, and I think this is very tastefully done. But for my eyes, I think there were just a couple little fleeting moments in individual shots where there were some slight examples where it was just maybe a little too bright on a couple of moments for me. In particular, there's one shot earlier on in the film when Richard Attenborough's character is giving one of his briefings, and there's a sort of sign or white calendar on the wall behind him that in the Dolby Vision HDR is just, maybe just a tad brighter than everything else around it. I think most people will be very pleased with the HDR presentation. And again, it is very good overall. It is an improvement over the old Kino Disc SDR presentation, but for me, there were maybe one or two fleeting moments where it was just a tad bright in one or two areas. But again, I'm very much a purist when it comes to catalog films, and any sort of degree of HDR maybe pushing things a little bit out of the original parameters automatically sort of makes me focus on it perhaps more than others would. So again, that's just my own particular feelings, but I do think overall the Dolby Vision and HDR10 is an exceptionally tasteful enhancement in regards to the visual appearance, as otherwise this is the exact same master that was released before by other labels, but only in SDR. So if you want, you can compare the two, and I know there are some who still prefer the appearance of the Kino Lorber UHD presentation, but honestly, I think the overall visual improvements and also the disc encoding is so superior to the Kino release that I do think it pretty much makes this a no-brainer in terms of a visual upgrade. In short, you are going to be seeing the same presentation you saw previously on the Kino and Criterion releases in terms of the same source master, with the same levels of slight scratching, inherent wear, some visible hairs, a little bit of image fluctuation, slight movement and things, but essentially fully realized on this Aero presentation with fantastic encoding and a lovely HDR enhancement. So it's really maximizing the full potential of this pre-existing 4K master. In other words, it basically does the work that people should have done before this point, and then kind of begs the question, why didn't MGM do this stuff themselves when they first made this? And then we turn to the audio, which is just as important an upgrade as the picture is. This, of course, gives us the 5.1 remix that has existed since the 2000s, but it's not really the way you should listen to this film. This film has a lovely mono mix, which has finally been retransferred, the first time since Criterion did their transfer, and this one thankfully does not overdo it on the overzealous modern processing that's frequently found on audio tracks of the past. This is a fuller sounding and more detailed version of the mono mix than what you get on either the Criterion or Kino releases, and is coming from master materials, so it does have an edge over even the old MGM Laserdisc mono in a number of areas. So this is really the first time the film has sounded really good in its original mono mix since the MGM Laserdisc. There does seem to have been some slight degrees of hiss and noise reduction here and there. None of it is seemingly very heavy-handed, and I did do a lot of comparisons between all the mono mix versions I have. Personally, I would put this up against the MGM Laserdisc and say that both of them are pretty much the best sounding versions of the film you can have, and maybe if you're a complete audio purist like I am, you'll also want to have the MGM Laserdisc track on hand just to have that exactly as that audio source was, as it was pretty much seemingly transferred directly straight without processing the signal whatsoever. But this new rendering on the Aero UHD is really well done, and I think, along with the visual improvements, it's worth upgrading over past releases simply for the picture and sound upgrades alone, even if most people may not be aware of how substantial these improvements actually are. They're not something that, immediately may jump out to the average viewer at first, but when you watch the entirety of the film, I think you'll be able to better appreciate how the additional work that's been performed here enhances the experience. But the difference in terms of the increase of quality in the mono mix, I think justifies purchasing the new Aero release simply for that factor alone. Now we turn to the packaging and artwork. So this has, of course, a lovely hard case with the slipcover that Aero has started doing on their more modern box sets. This has brand new, fantastic artwork by Sam Hadley that features beautiful likenesses of the main cast, and of course the iconic image of McQueen on the motorcycle from the finale, and the classic Great Escape lettering. While I do think the original Frank McCarthy poster is one of the great film posters, and what I probably would have gone with for the artwork, I think this is a stunning piece of art that also makes the Aero stand out and gives it a unique cover image to distinguish itself with. So I think this is probably the best artwork the film has actually had on home video in terms of its overall effectiveness. I really love the classic Criterion Laserdisc layout and how they use the barbed wire and everything, so that's always been my favorite video cover. I think the Criterion Blu-ray had really lovely artwork, and of course the Kino release actually did use a section of the Frank McCarthy one-sheet artwork, but overall, I think for a deluxe package trying to have a unique, distinctive image, I think this is exceptionally well done. And again, the artwork is really fantastic, and of course gets in the barbed wire, and also the aesthetics carry on to the rest of the package in terms of the spine, and of course the rear with the list of supplements. Take the slipcover off to find the art reproduced on the case itself, and this has a bit of a more textured, flatter finish, which looks really nice. We have the same spine and then the standard credits on the back. We have the same art on the case, which also has the list of supplements, but as they usually do, Aero nicely includes original artwork on the reverse, so you can flip the art around and display the iconic Frank McCarthy one-sheet original poster art. Inside we have a hinge tray with the UHD Feature Disc 1, and then the Region B locked second Blu-ray with all of the additional supplemental features. So if you're here in the US and you don't have region-free capability, you will not be able to view the Special Features Blu-ray, but that's pretty common to see on most UK import titles, so do keep that in mind that the Special Features disc is region locked. And then you find the limited exclusive Disc 3 UHD, which is of the miniseries follow-up quasi-sequel that I'll discuss in a moment. Now to talk about the substantial supplemental features package. The UHD disc does include 2 commentary tracks. These 2 commentaries are from past releases, both worked on and produced by the great Stephen J. Rubin. The first is a vintage commentary track that takes interview excerpts from John Sturges and members of the cast and crew and is moderated by Stephen J. Rubin. The second is another track that he did with Steve Mitchell, and of course is a really great track to listen to for getting into more of the historical facts of the actual Great Escape, as he is not only a lifelong fan of the Great Escape and has worked on pretty much the vast majority of all of the documentaries and supplemental features in regards to the film, but he's also the author of an excellent book, Combat Films: American Realism. So you get 2 fantastic commentaries, but unfortunately, Arrow was not able to license the Criterion Laserdisc commentary. Criterion typically does not allow their commentaries to be licensed for other releases, which is a shame because the Criterion commentary is a treasure trove of information and has extended comments from John Sturges that have some materials that are not part of the interview pieces that are in the commentary sections on this disc from the MGM commentaries. So you do need to hang on to your Criterion releases specifically just for the Criterion Laserdisc commentary to have in addition to these here. But the tracks here are excellent, and I'm sure if Criterion would have been willing, then Arrow would have licensed and included the classic Laserdisc commentary as well. And lastly, the feature disc also includes the film's theatrical trailer. This is a scope trailer, and it's in pretty solid condition in terms of not having major damage to it, but it is an older standard definition transfer that's been upscaled, so unfortunately it's not a modern HD scan, but at least we do have one sample of the film's original promotion, although this does look like maybe a later trailer because it has a UA Transamerica logo at the end, so maybe it was a reissue trailer. So the bulk of the supplements are of course on the separate Blu-ray disc, which is entirely devoted to supplemental features. The lead extra of this disc is a new supplement entitled The Real Great Escape, where Guy Walters, who wrote a book of the same name, really digs into the production of the film and the history of the real escape from Stalag Luft 3, and shows the difference between the directions the film takes and what actually occurred in real life. This is a really well done discussion that gets into great amounts of detail, but it's still really easily digestible to anyone who's just seeing the film for the first time. So if you know absolutely nothing about the real historical events and have only seen the film, this is a perfect means of having an encapsulated knowledge of the real events and where the film differs, and how the film manages to also respect the events without actually doing them exactly as they occurred. So it's really well done and really well put together, and even though it's 30 minutes, not a single second is wasted. The next piece is another new supplement entitled The Great Escapism. This runs 28 minutes, and it's an appreciation and discussion of the film's production history by Jose Arroyo, who is a film professor. This is another fantastic discussion that will give you great insight into the film, and very much a great follow-up to the first supplement, so it's nice to watch them together as they flow very well into one another. The next supplement is another new piece with Neil Brand entitled The Great Composer, which is entirely focusing on the great Elmer Bernstein and his absolutely iconic score and main theme for this film. And this is really nice because it gets beyond just the typical basic discussion of how wonderfully jaunty the theme is and how it becomes an earworm that you never forget and sort of hum and whistle for the rest of your life. But how that theme manages to become a perfect musical symbol of the sacrifice these characters made and their indomitable spirit, that the theme actually manages to fully replicate that spirit in only a short little bit of music, and it's astonishing how effective that is to this very day. Then we have a new video essay by Rich Johnson entitled Freedom Forged, and this specifically looks at The Great Escape and its overall place in World War II films, but also prisoner of war films. So it gives you a nice comparison to other films in the genre, and also discussing its relation to those, but also its historical realism and, of course, diverging from actual events. In a really nice touch, Arrow was able to actually license the major new video supplement from the Criterion release, which is a piece with critic Michael Sturgill talking about the film John Sturges and its place in Sturges' overall career. This is a really nice discussion that runs 20 some odd minutes, but it was something that was exclusive to the Criterion release. And since Arrow couldn't get the commentary from Criterion, it's really frankly kind of amazing and very surprising that they were able to get the major video supplement from the Criterion release. So basically, the only thing that the Criterion release has that's exclusive to it is the Laserdisc commentary. So if you're like me and you have the original Criterion Laserdisc, then you can safely actually pass on your old Criterion Blu-ray copy. And then the rest of the supplements are all of the legacy MGM extras. Pretty much all of these are coming from that special edition DVD release in the 2000s. They're of course all standard definition, but they do upscale well enough and have been well encoded so they look very presentable even when upscaled to 4K resolution. And that's something not a lot of studios and labels pay attention to, so it's really nice when somebody makes sure that old standard def extras actually look as good as they can. So these are really fantastic because not only were they produced by Stephen J. Rubin, but they actually managed to get a great number of interviews with some of the surviving prisoners of war from the original Great Escape, in addition to some bits of new interviews with the surviving cast and crew mixed in with archive materials and historian comments. So these actually add up to a pretty significant running time, but are nicely split into smaller sort of featurette and mini documentary pieces. So the first of these is Heroes Underground, which is a 4-part documentary talking about the general history of the real events, but mostly focusing on the overall production of the film. And this is really the sort of go-to best one-stop visual document of the production of the film. The next is entitled The Real Virgil Hilts, which is an interview with David Jones, who is the prisoner of war, who is mostly seen as the inspiration for the Steve McQueen Hilts character in the film. Then The Untold Story is a documentary focusing entirely on the real-life escape attempt, its development and actual execution, and the aftermath of the overall escape. Then there's an additional documentary simply entitled The Untold Story Additional Interviews, and these are further on-camera interviews with surviving prisoners of war from the real experience. And these are, of course, priceless because you're hearing the firsthand experiences directly from the individual's mouths. And that factor really makes all of these legacy supplements extraordinarily important as a historical document because you're getting that direct first-person recounting of the real events from the people who were really there. And then lastly is the 1993 Rubin-produced Return to the Great Escape, which was a documentary I think done originally for Showtime back in the 90s. And this has a lot of vintage interviews and really important materials, but also concludes with Rubin and his cameraman finding the real-life monument that was erected for the executed prisoners of war who were recaptured as part of the overall Great Escape. And that really makes that documentary have such a truly grounding moment of actually seeing that, and they basically had to uncover its location and such. So even though it contains information that's gone over in the other supplements, it's really nice that this was also included and kept as part of the legacy extras. And then lastly for Disc 2 is the photo and image gallery, but this is a very substantial gallery as it has over 100 really nice high quality images that are mostly production stills, set stills, a good number of fantastic black and white set stills, which have a lot of Steve McQueen practicing on the motorcycles, so these are priceless for fans of the film to pore over. But it's also got various lobby cards, promotional materials, and even examples of some of the original and foreign posters, so it's a really substantial image gallery. And then we turn to Disc 3, which is only in the limited edition set, and I think the element that really puts this release over the top in terms of additional fantastic efforts. And Disc 3 is the inclusion of the little discussed 1988 The Great Escape to the Untold Story, which is a two-part miniseries that was done for, I believe, NBC back in the day. But this is a pretty darn impressive TV miniseries shot on film and given a brand new 4K transfer that got a limited, very pricey Blu-ray release in Europe. But Arrow managed to license that master and then went ahead and gave it a 4K UHD of its own in this set. So this actually will get you an entire 3-hour plus second feature, essentially, of a pretty impressively mounted production. Now, The Great Escape 2 as a film obviously is still a television miniseries. It does have the constraints of that form, but it does have quite substantial production values. They did build another replica of the camp, and interestingly, as a film, it's sort of straddling the fence of being a sequel to the film and being somewhat more historically accurate than the film was, but then also much more in the second part as it split into two parts for television. In the second act, it really sort of goes off on its own brand new narrative tangent of becoming more of a story about tracking down the individuals who committed the murders of the recaptured prisoners of war. So it becomes more of a hunting Nazis film. But overall, it's actually quite a entertaining and interesting watch, and I really appreciated the elements that were adhering more to the actual events of history and at least giving us more of the actual real life individuals under their actual names instead of the film versions. But also there are concessions and nods made back to the original film. So again, it's sort of an odd experience because it's not really a sequel to the film and it's not really the historical events as they happened and the aftermath, but we have some elements of reality and the film sort of mashed together in this TV miniseries. But because it was shot on film and had substantial production values, it does feel like a fully fledged movie in areas, and it does have some really nice star power in terms of having Christopher Reeve and Judd Hirsch in the cast. But in terms of the film's greatest element and what makes it more effective than it probably should be is Reeves' performance. He really throws himself into this 200%, whether he's digging furiously and collapsing escape tunnels that are pretty well mounted for a TV miniseries production, or when his character is attempting escapes, or working undercover trying to gather information, while incorporating more of actual historical facts in areas than the film had. Again, this is a TV miniseries from the 80s. It's obviously a TV miniseries from the 80s, especially when you have the film split into two and having the sort of episode break and then come back the next night and watch part two. You can obviously watch them entirely together and watch the whole 3+ hours, but it is very much broken into two. But Reeves' performance is really the main draw and what keeps you invested, because he really throws himself into this. You can tell that he was very much interested in the material and trying to do it justice. I think Judd Hirsch is also really effective in the film, but then also you have Donald Pleasance in a smaller role, actually playing a Nazi officer, and it's quite a change from his iconic performance in The Great Escape film as the Forger, and of course extraordinarily ironic because Pleasance himself was a prisoner of war in a German camp, so he must have felt extraordinarily odd playing a sadistic Nazi character in this sort of follow-up inspired by the original Great Escape film he was in. So that's another element that makes this rather unique, and I'm really glad that Arrow has made this more available, because I think all fans of the Great Escape film and all history buffs will get something out of this. Of course, I think it will be more effective to some audiences than others, and of course it doesn't really do the historical fact either, but it has more elements that the film didn't have. And it even has another connection to the film, as the second episode was directed by Judd Taylor, who was originally an actor and had a notable role in the original Great Escape film. Now, in terms of the technical presentation of this transfer, it seems to be coming from a 4K master that was made quite obviously for the UK Blu-ray release. That was a 2-disc set a short while ago, before the Arrow release was made of the actual Great Escape film. So here it is basically, I think, going back to that 4K source scan, and this obviously did not have a full restoration budget, and it's a 1980s miniseries, so I don't think it was ever going to get the sort of red carpet treatment. So this is a really solid master and presentation, but it does have inherent wear and damage and frame movement and things scattered throughout. So, while it would have been nice to see this get a full restoration, it's really high quality for what it is, and they had a really nice element to work with. The image is matted to 1.78 to 1, so it will fill your 16:9 TV screen, but originally the miniseries would have shown in Academy ratio on televisions of the era. But it does seem like it was obviously protected for matting to widescreen, as a lot of miniseries would sort of at least keep that in mind, because they were shooting on film, and it could be at least shown theatrically in that sense if that ever arose. So all of the compositions look fine. Obviously, as a purist, I would have preferred having the original broadcast ratio, but everything looks fine here in terms of composition. This is really a nice bonus inclusion, as before this point and before that recent UK Blu-ray, all you could find were old masters, primarily on VHS, that also were of an edited condensed version. So at least here, you're getting to see a surprising 4K scan on an SDR UHD of the complete 2-part miniseries that runs over 3 hours long. And Arrow was kind enough to license this scan and encode it very well on its very own UHD, which they really didn't have to do. I think most would have just tried to shove this on a Blu-ray and call it a day, if they even included it at all. But the fact that they actually licensed this new master and then decided to give it its own UHD, which costs substantially more than making a Blu-ray, and did this even though the master is clearly only SDR and it's not a full restored transfer with some element issues baked in, and is basically a solid as-is presentation, is a real sign to how much attention and care Arrow put into this release, and it's really appreciated by all of us who picked it up, I think. The audio on this is, of course, flat stereo. A lot of TV productions did use matrixing at the time, but if you try to do that with this, it pretty much just spreads the sound out a little bit, but there's not much surround activity, so it's very much a television stereo mix of the time, but it does have some nice moments of bigger sound here and there, and some good sound effect usage, and has a pretty nice score that does try to be reminiscent of the iconic Bernstein theme in places. So even the score of this is pretty impressive. But like the picture, it's not in absolutely perfect shape. There's a little bit of distortion here and there and some source defects. So do go into this pretty much expecting a solid modern scan of an as-is element that I think overall cleans up better than what you would expect. The only thing I really noticed on this presentation is that almost at the very end of part 2, there's one shot that has some unfortunate frozen grain baked in it, but I think that's part of the source scan that people did originally, and obviously some attempt at cleanup they tried. It's a shame that there's one example of frozen grain in this, but it's only one shot at the very end of part 2. And then the only extra on this disc is a trailer. This is basically a new 4K trailer that's compiled of clips from this new 4K master. So it's a modern 4K trailer, but it's actually nice that somebody took the time to actually make some sort of trailer, and nicer that it's included here on the disc as well. Then we turn to the exclusive limited booklet that goes along with this set, and is beautifully done to look like the German documents as seen in the film. Nicely treated to have a sort of tangible feel, almost like you're holding the documents in your hand. This is beautifully done to sort of mimic the documents and dossiers you see in the film with a great deal of images. We have some really lovely new critical and historical essays with nice readable text, and it is just really nicely put together. And then, of course, it concludes with the restoration credits and disc credits with the mention that Fidelity and Motion did the feature disc encoding, and then the Engine House did the other discs in the set. We also get a double-sided poster, as Arrow likes to do. This is a really nice mini poster of the new artwork on a thinner but very glossy paper stock, so it looks really quite nice. And then the reverse is a mini poster reproduction of the iconic Frank McCarthy one-sheet poster. So that is the limited edition Arrow Video 4K UHD release of the classic The Great Escape. This is a really fantastic package that is certainly the most comprehensive release the film has ever had, and I think it does about as best as anyone can with the MGM 4K Master, so it does improve upon the efforts of both Criterion and Kino Lorber, making this a substantial upgrade in picture and sound, not to mention overall upgrade in supplements and being the most comprehensive and exhaustive supplements package the film has ever had. It also has the fantastic artwork, the wonderful limited edition case, slipcover, wonderful booklet, poster, but also the decision to include the very little seen Great Escape 2 television miniseries from a modern 4K scan, and then giving that its own UHD as well, really adds value to the overall package, which I think is a steal at the $35 list price it's been going for. I do believe this set is pretty much sold out in most areas, and they will transition over into doing the standard edition. The standard edition will have all of the same disc contents of disc 1 and 2, but you will unfortunately lose out on all the limited package materials and, of course, the UHD disc 3 of The Great Escape 2. So I do think this is one of the more important Arrow limited sets to pick up, and I think it really does vault ahead of past releases. You may only want to have one or two of the past releases to also make sure you have everything, in particular having the Criterion Laserdisc commentary on either the original Criterion Laserdisc or the Criterion Blu-ray. But outside of that, and having the MGM Laserdisc and first DVD for that unique transfer, and the ultra wide master with the untouched digital PCM on the MGM Laserdisc. Outside of those, the Arrow release is really as comprehensive as it gets, and really, I think, improves upon the past HD and UHD releases to such a degree that it's doing about the best anybody possibly can with the MGM 4K Master as we have it. So this really, I think, shows necessary efforts were put in to make this release as good as it could be, and it's a really satisfying release for this film that has had a variety of different releases that had a lot of positives, but none of them really knocked it out of the park and did the job as good as we all wished it could have been. Of all the modern releases, I think the Arrow set is the one that manages to take the existing MGM 4K Master and manage to cut through the video barbed wire and actually make it to something that is much more comprehensive and approaching an archival release in a lot of areas. So this is an essential upgrade title, I think. The value for money is extreme in terms of the amount of incredible supplements, the amount of quality increase in both picture and sound, and the fantastic package overall. This is really what the film has always deserved, and I think it manages to be a release that you can safely replace most past releases releases. So as always, I hope my babblings about classic films has been at least somewhat fun and informative. I do think the Arrow release is really fantastic and shows a lot of hard work went into making this as good as it could be, and that very much shows in every aspect of digging through this release. This is a disc set that you get, and you will have to spend a good deal of time to actually go through all of the supplements and the secondary feature in terms of the inclusion of the miniseries. So you very much get your money's worth, and it is very much respectful of the film's iconic status. So as always, please do keep supporting both studios and boutique labels by buying films on disc in order to help keep both physical media and film culture alive. And as always, thank you ever so much for watching.